appreciate Diane preaching for you all last week while I was gone. And I'm going to pick up where I left off a couple weeks ago. We were in the middle of a sermon series on the 4 sermon songs in the book of Isaiah. Those servant songs, we need to remember that while they sound like they're directed toward an individual, they were truly directed to the entire community, the whole people of Israel at the time, who were called to be a light to the world, to the nations. And they were called to do that by having these different characteristics, which really makes them not just individuals or people trying to be a light to the world, but leaders in being a light and a servant. The first sermon was about gentleness, the gentleness of a servant leader. The second was about the integrity of a servant leader. Today we're obviously talking about listening, as you heard me talking with the kids. And next week we get kind of the tough one, because we talk about the role of suffering in leadership. So this is one of my favorite of Mark Nepo's books. It's called 7,000 Ways to Listen. You can see how well I like books by how many little tabs I have on them. So he says this: are you able to listen and receive, or are you observing and manipulating? We all do both. Sooner or later, we are shown that life is one ongoing conversation, and none of what matters reveals itself unless we stop to listen. In this way, listening becomes a partnership by which we listen and converse with everything. So I invite you to explore the one conversation. When you feel you can't listen anymore, listen some more. When you feel you can't take anymore, let more in. When you feel you can't give anymore, let one more thing go. All of this is the work of being human, from which no one is exempt.
I will be reading from Isaiah in the Old Testament. Exalted Yahweh has given me a skilled and well-trained tongue, so that I can sustain the weary with a timely word. God awakens me morning after morning, awakens my ear to listen like a student. Exalted Yahweh, open my ears, and I have obeyed. I did not turn away. I offered my back to those beating me, offered my cheeks to those who would humiliate me. I did not hide my face from insults or spitting, because exalted Yahweh helps me. Insults cannot wound me, for I have set my face like flint, because I know I will not be put to shame.
Would you pray with me? Gracious Spirit, help me to get out of the way. Help us to put down our expectations and our preconceived notions, that we might be open to your voice, to your truth, to the way you dwell within each of us. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be pleasing and full of wisdom. Amen. So when I read this passage, this third servant song, 3 things jumped out at me. The first was that this servant was given a skilled and talented voice for sustaining the weary. The second one was that they were given ears to listen like a student. Seems to me you can only talk and sustain people by actually having ears that listen. And the third is that it speaks a great deal to me of humility. So let me begin by talking about this piece about listening like a student. And even before we get there, let's do some semantics. What's the difference between hearing and listening?
Attention. get the message we're hearing, you just hear the sound.
Right. So hearing is the auditory, it's the ability to receive the sound wave. The physical ability to receive the sound wave. Listening, as Jim said, is getting the message. So you actually not only hear the sound, receive the sound, but you perceive and you understand what the speaker's trying to say. So my hope is that you are not just hearing me this morning, but that you are listening to what I have to say. Did you know that 85% of our learning takes place by listening? And yet, as humans, we only really have a 25% comprehension level. Which probably means we need to hear things a whole lot of times before we actually learn them. So to listen like a student, what does that mean? What does that look like? Intensity. So you're focused and intense. Comprehension. So you're comprehending. This is not like one of your students who's sleeping in class, Teresa. This is like one of the good students. You don't have those. The good.
Decoding.
I'm sorry, Mike?
Decoding.
Decoding. So you are analyzing and finding the hidden messages.
With fluency.
With fluency. Taking in the data. Okay. Interested in the topic. Okay. What might be the difference between listening like a student and listening like an expert? There you go. So an expert, maybe it's a different way of looking at it. So as a student, you're looking to see what you can learn. And so you can still be an expert and have a student's ear because you're still looking to learn more. It's also called beginner's mind. When you approach whatever you're going to approach, even if you know a lot about the subject as a beginner, so you want to learn more and absorb more. So I find it fascinating that Isaiah would give a servant leader a student's ability to listen, that beginner's mind. If you think about the person that you would go to, who will listen to you more deeply than anyone else, what makes them a good listener?
There's something called reflective listening.
Reflective listening?
Reflective listening, so you're talking and I say, so that made you unhappy?
Okay, so you reflect back what you believe you're hearing. So somebody might do that with you and helps to clarify. It's a clarifying question. So somebody who asks clarifying questions. Racine?
Listening and not thinking about what you're going to say next.
Sure. They're actually focused on what you're saying and not thinking about their response, jumping ahead, or interrupting. Mark Marilyn?
Not trying to solve your problem or what you're...
Not trying to solve your problem. They're not fixers. They're willing to just listen, be there. Caring about what they have to say. Absolutely. You have an interest in that person.
Being non-judgmental?
Non-judgmental. Absolutely. What else does that person do for you when they listen to you? Eye contact. Absolutely. It's really hard to have a conversation with somebody when they're looking at the TV or they're playing on their phone or their computer or they're looking out the window, which it's hard to preach that way too. If somebody get a deer go by on the golf course and all of a sudden it's like, oh, look at that.
Or a squirrel.
Squirrel. Anything else? That good listener, what are they for you?
They care about me. They care about what I'm trying to say.
Right. They have an invested interest in understanding what you're trying to say. They want to put themselves in your shoes a little bit to actually get it. They have some compassion. They have some empathy. They're willing to hold a safe space, right? They're confidential. So all of those pieces are part of a really good listener. And it makes sense to us why we want somebody who's a close friend or a partner to be a good listener. It makes sense why we want our children to be good listeners and why we want our parents or we want to be good listeners. How does it work with a servant leader? Why do we want a leader who's a good listener?
They can't represent us without knowing us.
They can't actually represent us without knowing us. What do we have if we have a leader who's not a listener? A dictator. An anti-democracy, is that what you said? Yeah. We've got a tyrant and a dictator, so because then they don't care about the people, like Joan and Clarice said. They don't have our best interests and our common good at heart. And these leaders are everywhere. Mark Nepo, to go back to the piece I read, said we can either be listening and receiving or we can be observing and manipulating. And we have those leaders who are observing and manipulating all over the place, whether they're in our schools or in our families or in our relationships or in our government or in our churches. We have those leaders who observe and manipulate. And simply just don't listen. You may have read in the newspaper about the rezoning of the land by 31 and 38 so that they could build a Culver's there and a gas station there, which really don't need to be there. And there was a town hall meeting that Julie and I went to because as really close neighbors, we have a vested interest, and the place was packed. Standing room only, we were standing in the back. And you could watch the council members and you can tell who was listening and who was observing and manipulating. There was at least one man who did not hardly glance at any of the speakers at all. He was just kind of, looking all over the place and not paying any attention. And he got called on it a couple of times by people who stood up to speak. And said, Mr. So-and-so, you're not even listening to us. You clearly don't care. He'd made up his mind. He was done. Not a leader that I could ever see, just from that behavior, had any compassion or care or interest in the common good. Even if he disagreed, he could listen. The other piece that Isaiah brings up is that concept of humility. That a good leader not only listens, but perhaps a big part of listening is to be a little bit humble and not have to jump in with your ideas and your advice, not have to fix, but to simply be present. There's a writer who talks about his experiences in Uganda, a country that's really been devastated by the amount of deaths to young people and old people and everyone in between, from disease and poverty and famine and war and violence. And the people who really are struggling with not being able to see a peaceful future for themselves and their families. And this writer said, there's a lot of people who are willing to just point fingers about what's going on. Oh, it's the rebels' fault. It's the government's fault. It's the international community's fault because they're not stepping in and fixing it. So there are very few leaders who are willing to take some responsibility and be present with the people in the midst of that. But he lifts up one, Archbishop John Baptist Odama, who, as he toured around the country, when he would meet with children to talk to them about what was going on and to hear what was going on, he regularly got down on his knees and asked for their forgiveness for not being able to do enough to provide a peaceful growing up for them. There was one momentous event where he was doing a mass confirmation at a refugee camp, which had thousands of people who had been displaced from their homes. And there were many adults present, and there were high-ranking military officials present. And as he addressed the crowd, he, at one point, asked the children to stand up. And then he said to them, he said, what's happening here to this country and to you is wrong. He said, you don't have enough food, you're dressed poorly, many of you are very sick. You've lost your future because you don't have education. And you walk in fear. He said, it's wrong. And someday, you're going to grow up and you're going to say, what happened here? Where were the elders who were supposed to protect us? And I said, I want to say to you right now, I apologize. I apologize that I did not do more to ensure that you had a safe life and a good life. And he got down on his knees before the whole crowd and he asked for their forgiveness. Here was a man who listened to the plight of the people, who saw the miserable conditions and didn't just point a finger somewhere else. And you know that someone like that was working as hard as they could to make it better, and yet still saying, you know, there must be more that we can do, that I can do. And as a leader, I recognize that and I take responsibility. I'm not pointing at everybody else, but I'm saying I need to do something. That integrity we talked about last time. And what that leader does by saying that is to challenge everybody else in that place to look at themselves and what they're doing as well. Right? To challenge everyone to listen to each other and to what's going on in their own hearts around whatever situation it is. So there's one other piece that I would be remiss if I didn't bring up. And that's that we need to listen to God. We need to listen to our intuition, the still small voice within us, our gut, our heart, however you want to name that. We need to be listening inside. And that's not always easy, and it doesn't always take us where we want to go. And sometimes we'd really prefer that we got a different route, but we know inside. There's a story about William Edmonston. Anybody know who William Edmonston was? Because I didn't until recently. William Edmonston was born in 1874. He was a janitor for most of his life. And then one day he had a vision that God had planted the seed of ability to sculpt in him when he slept. And so he started to sculpt. He found old discarded pieces of limestone, he took a railroad spike and a worn out hammer, and he started to carve these amazing sculptures. And in 1937, he was the first African-American artist to have a solo exhibition at the New York Museum of Modern Art. Because he listened to that voice. And he was a leader in a different way. He was a leader for every African-American artist who wanted to believe they could be something and achieve something in a world that was so very segregated and oppressive at the time. We all have the ability to lead. Wherever we are, with whomever we're with, to be that servant leader that is gentle, that has integrity, that is humble, that listens. I don't care if you're with your friends or your family or a group like this or at work or standing up in a town hall meeting. That's the leader we're called to be. Amen.